Okay, let's unpack this. When World War II finally ground to a halt in 1945, the world wasn't just celebrating. It was utterly shattered.
Yeah, shatter's the right word. We're talking devastation on a scale that's almost impossible to really picture today.
Tens of millions dead, cities
Yeah.
just gone, rubble across Europe, across Asia, economies completely collapsed.
It's genuinely hard to convey the sheer human and physical costs you find in the sources. And beyond the death toll, you had this widespread displacement. People literally had nowhere left to go. Infrastructure annihilated.
You think of places like Warsaw,
Right.
Poland,
Yeah,
just fundamentally changed, erased in large parts.
exactly. Flattened.
So, in this deep dive, that's where we want to start. Looking at that immediate aftermath, what did the world actually look like in 45, 46, 47? The human costs, the economic shifts, the political realignments.
Right.
But we're not stopping there. We also want to kind of rewind the clock, peel back the layers on that incredibly complex, really turbulent period between the wars, between World War I and World War
The
II.
road that led there.
Precisely. The road that tragically led humanity into that second, even more horrific global conflict.
And to do that, we've gone through a whole stack of sources you provided. We've got overview texts on the aftermath, sure, but also some specific research digging into maybe overlooked areas, like wartime science, the experience of women,
Mhm.
and then a really detailed historical account that focuses specifically on those interwar years, the 20s and 30s.
Yeah, so our goal here is to go through this material together, pull out the most important nuggets. The facts, yes, but maybe more importantly, the insights, connecting the dots, finding those surprising details, understanding the critical forces at play.
Both in the war's wake and in the decades that led up to it.
Exactly. So let's start right there, right after 1945, that immediate post-war world, as you said, the devastation. Immense.
And beyond the raw numbers killed, the sources really highlight the massive displacement. Whole populations uprooted, sometimes forcibly.
And the economic challenge must have been just staggering.
Oh, unbelievable. Europe's industrial heartland was largely destroyed. And one of the key insights here is the scale of the U.S. response.
Right. They recognized the danger, the potential for more instability.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
the United States steps in with the European Recovery Program.
Mm-hmm.
We know it better as the Marshall Plan.
Mm-hmm.
And the sources show between 1948 and 1952, the U.S. government poured, what was it, $13 billion into reconstruction in Western Europe.
13 billion back then, which, when you adjust for inflation,
It's enormous,
Hmm.
roughly 140 billion in today's dollars. And you have to understand, this wasn't just aid, like charity. It was a massive strategic investment.
stabilizing economies, creating trading partners.
And let's be clear, creating a bulwark against communism. That was
Yeah.
definitely part of the calculation.
And it's interesting, the sources point out you saw really different rates of recovery across Europe.
Strikingly different, yeah.
Yeah.
West Germany, Italy, France, they rebounded really strongly. By the late 1950s, their production had doubled from pre-war levels.
But the UK, maybe surprisingly, given they were on the winning side,
Experienced a relative economic decline, actually. That lasted for decades after the war.
Hmm.
A really different trajectory.
and meanwhile, the Soviet Union, despite just immense losses.
They saw a rapid increase in industrial production quite quickly. Now, through a vastly different centrally planned model,
Yeah.
obviously, but still rapid recovery in output.
And Japan, there were initial plans to kind of limit their industry, right?
Yeah, some early plans aimed to roll back their industrial capacity, keep them weak, but that shifted. Japan also experienced incredibly rapid economic growth, eventually emerging as a major global economy by the 1980s.
What about China? They'd suffered through the Japanese invasion and then a civil war.
Essentially bankrupt,
Yeah.
just devastated. Yet the sources show they somehow managed to reach pre-war production levels by 1953, which is incredible. Before being massively disrupted again by things like the Great Leap Forward famine later on,
And the United States.
emerged utterly dominant, producing about half the world's industrial output right at the end of the war. Entering this period of, well, unprecedented economic expansion, that power shift is just critical to understanding everything that followed.
Okay, so that's the economic picture. Shifting to the political and territorial landscape. The end of the war meant redrawing maps, restructuring power.
Completely.
Yeah.
And the sources give a really detailed example with the 1947 Treaty of Peace with Italy. It formally ended their colonial empire, for starters.
And involved significant territory changes, too.
Oh, yes. Italy ceded the Aegean Islands to Greece, some borderland to France, and crucially, large areas along the Adriatic coast. We're talking Istria, Kvarner, the Julian March, the city of Zara. All went to Yugoslavia.
Which wasn't just lines on a map, right? That had a huge human impact.
Massive. It caused this huge exodus of ethnic Italians, the Istrian Dalmatian exodus. Estimates vary, but somewhere between 230,000 and 350,000 people chose to leave their homes rather than stay under Yugoslav rule.
Wow, and Italy had to pay reparations as well.
Yep. 360 million in 1938 dollars paid out to various countries.
Yeah.
And then you had the complex situation around Trieste.
Right, the Free Territory of Trieste.
Initially, under UN administration, it was a real point of contention for years. Eventually divided in 1954, formally annexed by Italy later in 75, and their former colony, Italian Somaliland, became a UN trust territory, administered by Italy, actually, until independence in 1960.
And for Japan, we mentioned the early deindustrialization ideas.
Which were pushed by some allied factions,
Yeah.
aiming to roll back their standard of living to pre-war levels, basically remove their military threat permanently. It wasn't implemented quite as severely as some plans for Germany, but it was part of the initial strategy.
Did they get aid too?
Yes, Japan received emergency aid, things like Garioa and Lara. But a key report in 1948, the Johnston Committee report, actually recommended shifting towards reconstruction, partly because the cost of just providing aid relief was becoming unsustainable for the U.S.,
Interesting. And this period also marks the formal end of the League of Nations.
which had so spectacularly failed to prevent the war in the first place.
And the founding of the United Nations. A new attempt, hopeful, but as we know, ultimately challenged.
A fresh start or an attempt at one?
But let's zoom in a bit. Away from the high-level geopolitics, the sources also talk about these, well, unseen horrors, lingering dangers, things people don't often discuss today.
That's true. And one deeply disturbing issue, highlighted quite starkly in the sources, was the horrific and widespread problem of rape during the occupation and liberation phases.
This was across the board, Europe and Asia.
It occurred across both, yes, though the sources detail, varying scales and circumstances depending on the armies and regions involved. In Europe, Soviet troops certainly committed rapes and robberies in places like Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia. But the sources emphasize it was significantly worse, perhaps more systematic, in Germany itself.
The estimates are just harrowing.
They really are. Sources cite figures like around 1.9 million German women raped by Red Army soldiers by the war's end. In Berlin alone, the estimate is maybe a third of all women were victims.
Third,
Some hospital records there suggest between 95,000 and 130,000 women raped by Soviet troops. And tragically, maybe 10,000 of those women died, mostly, it seems, by suicide.
that's horrific. How did the Soviet command react?
Officially, often denial, or blaming it on German bandits, sometimes even trying to justify it based on German atrocities in Russia. Though the sources do note that by 1947, the Soviets did start trying to isolate their troops more, suggesting some internal recognition of the problem, perhaps to restore discipline.
But the sources are clear it wasn't only Soviet troops involved in this kind of violence.
No, absolutely not. There are reports, including from a U.S. Army sergeant, mentioning looting and raping by U.S. and British soldiers, too. One analysis, looking at military records, suggests around 14,000 rapes by U.S. soldiers in Britain, France, and Germany between 42 and 45.
And that's likely underreported.
Very likely, yes. Though it is noted that commanding officers did bring charges in some cases. But other estimates, specifically for U.S. soldiers in Germany, go much higher, potentially up to 190,000 according to one historian, Gebhardt.
And in Italy.
During the Italian campaign, the Gumiers, these were French-Moroccan troops serving with the French forces. They were accused of widespread rape and murder against Italian civilians. These acts became known in Italy as the Moroccanate. Victim associations estimate over 7,000 civilian victims.
It's awful. What about in Japan during the U.S. occupation?
Similar patterns initially. Sources describe rape and violent crime being widespread in the early weeks, especially in naval ports like Kanagawa Prefecture. One report mentioned over 1,300 rapes there in just the first 10 days.
Were civilians trying to protect themselves?
Yes, the Japanese tried forming vigilante guards to protect women, but apparently these were suppressed by the U.S. Army. British Commonwealth troops were also implicated. And on Okinawa, the historian Oshiro Masayasu describes widespread rape happening almost immediately after the U.S. landing, women being dragged from shelters.
Were these incidents reported?
One historian estimates 76 reported cases in Okinawa's first 5 years, but emphasizes that most incidents almost certainly went unreported. Shame, fear, the usual reasons.
And we absolutely have to mention the comfort women.
Yes. A horrific systematic crime. The Japanese military established this system, forcing an estimated 200,000 girls and women, primarily from Korea and China, but other areas too, into sexual slavery in military brothels,
And this was hidden for a long time.
tragically ignored for decades. Particularly in Confucian cultures, the immense shame associated with it silenced victims and made it a very difficult history to uncover and acknowledge. There was one successful Dutch case, though, at the Batavia Military Tribunal in 1948, which was an early, if isolated, instance of accountability.
Such deep scars. And the sources also mention another sad human consequence, the war children.
Right. Children left behind by German soldiers in occupied countries, France, Denmark, Norway. They often faced discrimination, recrimination, stigma after the war, just for who their fathers were.
And shifting from human scars to physical dangers, the war left behind things that are still a threat today.
It's incredible, isn't it? Unexploded ordnance, bombs from WWII are still being found regularly.
Like that incident in Hanover, Germany in 2017.
Exactly. 50,000 people had to be evacuated just to defuse one WWII bomb found during construction work. And experts think there are thousands still underground, undiscovered, as of 2023.
It's mind-boggling. And then there are the environmental risks from the post-war cleanup.
Yeah, this is quite alarming. The sources estimate allied nations, UK, US, Russia included, dumped about 1 million metric tons of captured or surplus chemical weapons onto the ocean floor after the war.
Why? Just couldn't dispose of them properly.
Basically, yeah, no real disposal methods existed, so they dumped them at sea, and now they're rusting down there. Sources report people being exposed to sulfur mustard near coastal dump sites and even finding bombs accidentally brought up far from dump sites, mixed in with shellfish cargo.
Good grief. It really drives home that the war didn't just neatly end in 1945.
Not at all.
Yeah.
Its consequences, human, environmental, psychological, they stretched out for decades. And in some ways, they're still unfolding today.
And speaking of things stretching out, those immediate post-war tensions, they didn't just fade away. They quickly morphed into a new global standoff.
The Cold War.
Exactly. Which leads us to a really fascinating, maybe morally complex aspect the sources reveal, the recruitment of former enemies.
Absolutely. As the geopolitical landscape shifted, as tensions just skyrocketed between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, those initial Allied war crimes programs, the denazification policies, they were significantly relaxed, sometimes even abandoned.
Why?
Well, in favor of recruiting former enemies who had valuable intelligence or, crucially, scientific expertise, it's a key insight into the, let's say, pragmatism or maybe opportunism of the emerging Cold War. Priorities shifted fast.
So they started recruiting people who might have been considered war criminals just months before.
In some cases, yes. For espionage, for covert operations. The sources mention figures like Alexandras Leleikis. He was a Lithuanian collaborator, head of a unit that oversaw the murder of maybe 60,000 Jews. A horrific record.
And he was recruited.
Later worked for the CIA, yes, despite that history.
Wow. Any other examples?
The British Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, ran operations like Operation Jungle. They actively recruited and trained Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, people fiercely anti-Soviet, to work clandestinely against the Soviets back in the Baltic states.
How did they get them in?
Sources mention they even used former German Navy E-boats to transport agents. MI6 also tried infiltrating agents from Finland into the USSR to assassinate officials. Bold stuff.
But were these operations successful?
Often compromised, actually. As the sources reveal, Kim Philby, the infamous British intelligence officer who was secretly a Soviet double agent, he played a huge role in the KGB penetrating and basically controlling MI6's Baltic intelligence network, a major blow.
So alongside this covert recruitment, you also see the big Cold War institutions forming?
Right. Major propaganda and espionage organizations get set up. Radio Free Europe, the CIA itself. And you also see this radicalization, a proliferation of both far-left and far-right terrorist groups emerging from the post-war chaos in Europe. It was a volatile time.
And then there was the recruitment of scientists. This seems like a really key area where those denazification policies were eased.
Oh, absolutely. Perhaps the most stark example. The sources detail the intense competition, particularly between the U.S. and Soviets, but also the British and French, to recruit German scientists, especially nuclear physicists and rocket scientists.
The guys who worked on things like the V2 rocket.
Exactly, people from Peenemünde. The Western Allies made a very deliberate decision, as the sources show, not to share captured German secret weapons tech or expertise with the Soviets.
So they actively hoarded it.
Pretty much. The U.S. had programs like Operation Lusty, specifically to grab advanced German aircraft technology and personnel. The British had similar efforts, like the Fed mission. It wasn't just about denying the Soviets, it was about gaining a direct strategic advantage in this new ideological conflict that was heating up incredibly fast.
So the immediate aftermath of WWII wasn't just about rebuilding, it was already about laying the groundwork for the next global struggle.
That's a very accurate way to put it. And it involves some, well, ethically fraught decisions about who to forgive, who to recruit, all in the name of national security against the perceived new threat.
A stark insight, as you said, into how quickly priorities can shift when a new big enemy appears on the horizon.
Mhm.
Okay, so to really understand how we even got to that point, the sheer scale of World War II, its chaotic aftermath, the start of the Cold War, we have to turn the clock back further. Let's dive into those turbulent interwar years. 1919 to 1939, this is the road to war.
And the absolute starting point for that road, you really can't overstate it, is the aftermath of World War I, and specifically the Treaty of Versailles in 1919.
Which was seen as incredibly harsh in Germany, right?
One of the key insights from the sources is just how deeply it was perceived as unjust. Humiliating. It wasn't just a list of terms. It became this potent symbol of national suffering and grievance.
And the terms were severe.
Oh, absolutely. Strict limits on the German army, basically gutted, only 100,000 men allowed. No aircraft, no submarines, no heavy artillery. Economically, you had hyperinflation partly fueled by the pressure, and then massive reparations payments, 13,000 million gold marks. A staggering sum back then.
Plus territory losses.
Significant ones. Alsace-Lorraine went back to France, parts of Silesia to the newly created Poland, and Germany lost all its overseas colonies, which were seized and handed out as mandates, mostly to Britain and France.
So for Germans, this treaty was just a constant source of resentment.
A constant, visible reminder of defeat and what they saw as profound injustice. Now, Michael Beck, a historian cited in the sources, he argues it wasn't the sole cause of WWII or the Nazi rise. He emphasizes you can't ignore the Great Depression later on.
Right.
But Beck does stress that Versailles was this incredibly powerful symbolic factor. It fueled that resentment that extremists could then exploit.
And politically, the whole map of Europe and the Middle East was redrawn after WWI.
Completely. You saw the dramatic collapse of these huge old empires. The Russian, the German, the Austro-Hungarian, the Ottoman, gone.
And replaced by?
Numerous smaller states, stretching all the way from the Baltic Sea down to the Suez Canal. And in many of these new nations, and even in former monarchies like Germany itself, parliamentary democracy was introduced.
With one major exception.
Russia, of course, where the Bolsheviks had seized power and established a communist state. And in the Middle East, Britain and France got mandates, effectively colonial control over former Ottoman territories like Iraq, Syria, Palestine.
It's maybe not surprising, then, that someone like Winston Churchill, who lived through it all,
famously called World War I just a truce. The sources really back that up. The fundamental issues, the nationalist tensions, the grievances, they weren't resolved by Versailles. They were just kind of papered over, put on hold.
And those unresolved issues were then dramatically worsened by economic crises. Germany's hyperinflation in 1923.
Catastrophic. Partly triggered when France and Belgium occupied the Ruhr industrial region because Germany had missed reparation payments.
Right.
And then the German government made the disastrous decision to just print money to pay striking workers in the Ruhr, which completely destroyed the value of the currency.
Well,
People's life savings wiped out overnight.
were there attempts to stabilize things?
There were. Figures like Gustav Stresemann in Germany pushed for negotiation. That led to the Dawes Plan in 1924. An international committee came up with a more manageable payment schedule based on Germany's ability to pay. Foreign troops left the Ruhr. And this actually brought a period of fragile stability, even relative prosperity, in the mid-1920s.
But that stability didn't last.
No. It was shattered by the Wall Street crash in 1929 and the Great Depression that followed. This was global, devastating. The U.S., which had been lending money to Germany under the Dawes Plan,
Suddenly called in those loans.
exactly, pulled the rug right out from under the German economy. Mass unemployment soared. Banks failed again. People lost everything again. And this economic disaster, maybe more than anything else, as some sources argue, just destroyed public faith in the democratic Weimar Republic. It created fertile ground for extremist ideologies promising radical solutions.
Meanwhile, the Soviet Union under Stalin was on a totally different economic path.
Completely different. The sources detail the introduction of the first five-year plan in 1928. focused on rapid, brutal industrialization and forced collectivization of agriculture.
which had terrible consequences.
While it did boost industrial output significantly, the collectivization policies were catastrophic for agriculture, leading to widespread famine. Most notoriously, the Holodomor in Ukraine, which killed millions.
So, in this turbulent landscape, you see these powerful new ideologies emerge, rejecting democracy.
Fundamentally rejecting it. Fascism in Italy, led by Benito Mussolini. It grew partly out of Italian disappointment with their perceived lack of gains from the Versailles settlement. Mussolini himself defined fascism, articulating this belief in the necessity of war and conflict for the state's glory and strength.
And fascism shared core ideas with Nazism, rising in Germany under Hitler.
Yes, several key tenets overlap, as the sources show. Both believed in a kind of social Darwinist worldview survival of the fittest nations, where aggression was seen as strength. Both advocated for a strict social order, were fiercely anti-communist, believed in a single, all-powerful dictatorial leader, the Führer principle for the Nazis.
And the state was everything.
The state was absolute, central, rejecting individualism, liberal freedoms, everything subordinated to the state and the leader.
But Nazism had its own distinct, even more extreme elements.
Definitely. While sharing those characteristics, Nazism had a much more intense, obsessive focus on national and especially racial purity, driven by this virulent anti-Semitism and the goal of creating a racially pure Aryan state.
Hitler's party didn't seize power immediately, though.
No, they started small, famously failed with the beer hall putsch attempt in Munich in 1923. But then Hitler strategically shifted tactics, aiming to gain power through the parliamentary system. And riding the wave of the Depression crisis, they became the second largest party in the German Reichstag by 1930.
Do the sources point out key differences between Mussolini's fascism and Hitler's Nazism?
They do. For instance, Mussolini managed to maintain relatively functional, if sometimes tense, relations with the Catholic Church in Italy. Hitler, on the other hand, openly attacked religious minorities, especially Jews.
And their goals.
Mussolini's main focus seemed to be conquest to enhance the strength and glory of the Italian state. Hitler's primary drive was more about racial conquest and the unification of all perceived ethnic Germans or Aryans under one state, which included that explicit aim of Anschluss annexing Austria.
It's an interesting side note from the sources that so many key leaders in WWII were actually veterans of WWI.
It is. They carried lessons, grievances, perspectives directly from that first conflict into the second. Churchill, Hitler, Mussolini, they all served in WWI in some capacity. The experience shaped them profoundly.
And you also see military thinkers emerging, analyzing WWI, and planning for the next war.
Yes, analyzing the failures of trench warfare, thinking about mobility. George S. Patton in the U.S. was already advocating for independent, fast-moving tank warfare. Charles de Gaulle in France wrote The Army of the Future, arguing for a professional mobile army built around tanks for rapid attack.
Rommel.
Erwin Rommel, later famous as the Desert Fox, wrote a book called Infantry Attack, based on his WWI experiences, emphasizing speed, surprise, deception, deep penetration of enemy lines, ideas that became central to Blitzkrieg. And interestingly, sources note Hitler himself later became very interested in Rommel's tactical thinking.
So as these ideologies took hold, leaders gained power. The 1930s became this decade of escalating aggression.
Absolutely. Aggression from the expansionist powers and a simultaneous stark failure of the collective security system, the League of Nations, that was supposed to prevent exactly this.
Japan started early, didn't they?
1931, the invasion of Manchuria. They set up the puppet state of Manchukuo, then they attacked Shanghai in 1932, created a demilitarized zone there. Later, the Tientsin incident in 1939, blockading the British concession, really ramped up tensions with the UK.
And the military gained more power within Japan.
Significantly more political control. After an attempted coup in 1936, yes. Full-scale war with China resumed in 1937, leading to horrific atrocities like the Nanjing Massacre, and Japan had already walked out of the League of Nations in 1933 after being condemned for Manchuria. They saw the League was toothless.
Italy followed suit with aggression.
Not far behind. 1935, Mussolini invades Ethiopia, the Second Italo-Ethiopian War. The League tried sanctions, but they were totally ineffective. It just highlighted the League's powerlessness again. Italy conquered Ethiopia, also left the League, and then invaded Albania in 1939.
And Germany under Hitler, systematically breaking treaties.
One after another, secretly rebuilding the Luftwaffe, the Air Force, from 1933, a direct violation of Versailles. Then in 1936, the huge gamble reoccupying the Rhineland, militarily demilitarized by Versailles and Locarno, and Britain and France did nothing militarily.
Which must have emboldened Hitler immensely.
Hugely. He saw the Western powers lack the will to enforce the treaties. Germany later renounced the Anglo-German Naval Agreement in 1939, and critically, its non-aggression pact with Poland, signed only a few years earlier in 1934, setting the stage.
And this period is infamous for appeasement, especially Munich.
The Munich Agreement, September 1938, Britain, France, Italy, and Germany agreed to let Hitler annex the Sudetenland, that border region of Czechoslovakia with a large German-speaking population. It was sold by Chamberlain as achieving peace for our time, satisfying Hitler's supposedly final demand.
But it wasn't his final demand.
Not even close. The sources stressed how quickly it was proven a failure. Just months later, in March 1939, Germany marched in and took over the rest of Bohemia and Moravia, dismantling Czechoslovakia entirely. Appeasement had clearly failed to stop Hitler. It arguably just made him stronger and more convinced the West wouldn't fight.
And while all this international tension was building, the Nazi state was consolidating absolute power inside Germany.
Rapidly, ruthlessly. Hitler was appointed Chancellor, January 30th, 1933, by President Hindenburg, who, along with conservative elites, mistakenly thought they could control him in a coalition.
Big mistake.
Huge. Then, the Reichstag fire, February 27, 1933. Whether the Nazis said it or just exploited it, it gave Hitler the pretext he needed.
To do what?
Issue emergency decrees, suspending basic civil liberties, freedom of speech, press, assembly, gone. Then came the Enabling Act, passed through intimidation, which effectively gave Hitler dictatorial power to rule by decree. The Weimar Republic just collapsed. Reparations payments were stopped. And when Hindenburg died in August 1934, Hitler merged the posts of Chancellor and President. He became simply the Führer, supreme leader.
And the tools of control were put in place.
Immediately. Hermann Goering, already Reichstag president, was key. The Gestapo, the secret police, formed in 1933, put under Heinrich Himmler in 1934, became this terrifying instrument against any perceived enemies of the state.
For other political parties.
Banned by mid-1933, a one-party state. And the first concentration camp, Dachau, opened near Munich in March 1933. Initially for political opponents, communists, socialists, trade unionists, later expanding to imprison Jews, Roma, homosexuals, anyone deemed undesirable by the regime.
And the persecution of Jews began early and escalated.
Almost immediately. Sources detail the nationwide boycott of Jewish businesses in April 1933. Then came waves of discriminatory laws. By 1938, Jewish passports were invalidated, stamped with a J, making emigration harder. You even had Nazi ideologues attacking Jewish scientists, dismissing Einstein's relativity as Jewish physics, leading to those infamous book burnings. Einstein, fortunately, had already left Germany in 1932.
And Hitler even turned on rivals within his own movement.
The Night of the Long Knives, June 1934. A brutal purge. Hitler eliminated potential rivals, primarily Ernst Röhm and the leadership of the SA, the Nazi Party's original paramilitary wing, which he feared was becoming too powerful and independent.
Who benefited from that?
The SS, under Himmler. They carried out many of the killings. After the purge, the SS's power grew immensely, reporting directly to Hitler, becoming this elite, terrifying state within a state.
And the army's role changed, too.
Critically, in August 1934, after Hindenburg's death, the entire German military was made to swear an oath of personal loyalty, not to the Constitution or the state, but directly to Adolf Hitler as Führer. A hugely significant step, the sources highlight, binding the army to the regime's fate.
And then came Anschluss in 1938.
The annexation of Austria, the formal start of the Third Reich's territorial expansion, achieved largely without a shot fired due to internal Nazi agitation in Austria, diplomatic pressure, and the lack of intervention from other powers. German agents had been active in Austria for years, even attempting a coup and assassinating the Austrian Chancellor Dollfuss back in 1934.
So alongside all this internal consolidation and external aggression, alliances were forming, shifting.
Setting the stage for the opposing sides in the war. The Anti-Comintern Pact in 1936, primarily Germany and Japan, ostensibly an alliance against the Soviet Union and international communism.
Then Italy joins Germany more formally.
The Pact of Seal, May 1939, a full military alliance between Germany and Italy. Though the sources mention internal disagreements actually prevented Japan from joining that specific pact initially, shows these alliances weren't always perfectly smooth.
And then the most surprising pact of all.
Perhaps the most cynical, strategically crucial one. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, August 1939. A non-aggression pact between the bitterest ideological enemies, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, signed just days before the invasion of Poland.
And had secret clauses.
Absolutely critical secret protocols, the sources reveal, agreeing to basically carve up Eastern Europe between them. Poland would be partitioned. The Soviets would get a free hand in the Baltic states. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, plus parts of Finland and Bessarabia in Romania.
Why would Hitler agree to that, giving Stalin territory?
From Hitler's perspective, it was purely tactical. It neutralized the immediate threat of a Soviet attack on Germany's Eastern Front while he dealt with Poland and then potentially France and Britain. It bought him time and secured his flank for the initial phase of the war he was about to launch.
It's just remarkable looking back, all these complex political, economic, ideological forces just converging in those last few years before September 1939.
It really is. And adding yet another layer to this volatile mix, this period also saw huge scientific developments, things that would become terrifyingly relevant in the war itself.
Like in physics.
Exactly. The sources mention figures like Ernest Rutherford, a giant in physics, who even as late as 1933 was publicly dismissing the idea of using atomic energy for practical purposes, saying it was impossible.
But others were thinking differently.
That very same year, 1933, Leo Szilard, a brilliant Hungarian physicist then in London, actually conceived the theoretical possibility of a nuclear chain reaction using neutrons. He even patented the concept, laying the groundwork.
And then came the breakthrough.
Early 1939. Scientists in the U.S. successfully split the uranium atom, which demonstrated that Szillard's chain reaction idea wasn't just theoretical, it was potentially feasible on a massive scale.
Which led directly to that famous letter to Roosevelt.
The Einstein-Szilard letter, August 1939. Mostly written by Szilard, but signed by the much more famous Einstein to get the president's attention. It warned Roosevelt that Germany, with its top scientists and access to uranium, might be capable of developing an atomic bomb. And it urged the U.S. to start its own research project immediately.
The beginning of the Manhattan Project.
Widely seen as its genesis, yes. It's just fascinating and chilling how these world-altering scientific discoveries were happening right alongside the political breakdown and the military buildup towards total war. Science didn't exist in a vacuum.
No, it certainly didn't. It really connects all the threads, doesn't it? You have the unresolved issues, the perceived injustices from World War I, especially Versailles, the economic instability, all creating this deep resentment, this vulnerability, particularly in Germany.
Right. And that vulnerability was then massively exploited by the sheer devastation of the Great Depression, leading to this widespread loss of faith in democracy, creating fertile ground for extremist ideologies, Nazism, fascism offering simplistic answers, scapegoats, and the promise of national rebirth through aggression.
And the international system failed to stop it.
The collective security system, the League of Nations, proved utterly powerless. Appeasement by Britain and France, intended to avoid war, effectively just emboldened Hitler, Mussolini, and the Japanese militarists, showed them they could break treaties, invade countries with minimal consequences until it was too late.
And then, jumping forward again, in the immediate aftermath of WWII, the collapse of that wartime alliance between the West and the Soviets.
And the new ideological struggle, the Cold War, kicks off almost immediately. Geopolitical competition, proxy conflicts, and yes, that recruitment of former enemy scientists, spies in this desperate race for strategic advantage against the new adversary.
So the story really does come full circle in a grim way. The unresolved trauma of the First War directly sets the stage for the Second. And the chaotic, devastating end of the Second War immediately gives birth to the next global struggle, the Cold War.
All while leaving behind these incredibly deep, lasting scars. Physical scars, like unexploded bombs still turning up, chemical weapons rusting on the seabed, and the immeasurable psychological and social wounds from mass atrocities, the sexual violence, the comfort women system, the Holocaust itself, which we haven't even detailed here, but looms over everything.
It's a deeply complex, incredibly sobering history. It really highlights the fragility of peace, doesn't it? And the profound impact of economic hardship, political extremism, and, well, the failure of international cooperation. Thinking about that failure, especially after World War I, how economic crisis, those unresolved grievances, how they fueled the rise of these totalitarian ideologies, it does raise a pretty important question for us today, doesn't it?
How do societies respond when faced with really overwhelming challenges? With complex information, or maybe even just information overload like we have now.
Yeah. What stands out to you when you look back at how desperation, resentment, how these charismatic authoritarian leaders were able to gain such immense power and dismantle democratic structures so quickly in the interwar years?
Well, it certainly prompts reflection, I think, on the importance of really understanding these historical patterns and maybe the vital need for critical thinking for all of us to try and navigate the complexities of the world around us, thoughtfully, rather than reaching for those simple, often very dangerous answers that extremism tends to offer.
Always more to learn. Always more to understand.
Indeed.
Always.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.